My name is Cora Sterling. For as long as I can remember, my life has been painted in watercolors, while my brother's was carved in stone. I grew up in a house that smelled of salt and old wood, here in Port Blossom, a town that clings to the Maine coast like a stubborn barnacle. The fog rolls in thick and soft, blurring the edges of the world, and I've always felt a certain kinship with it. I find comfort in the undefined, in the potential of what might be. I build things from ideas, from whispers of color and code. I founded a small company, Lyra Systems, based on the belief that technology should feel less like a machine and more like a conversation. My brother, Julian, on the other hand, deals in absolutes. He lives and works in Boston, in a world of gleaming glass towers and hard data. His career at Apex Analytics, a monolithic data analytics firm, is a source of immense family pride. His success is tangible, measurable in quarterly reports and stock options. Mine, until recently, has been treated as a charming hobby, a passion project that keeps me busy. Have you ever loved a place so much it hurts? That's how I feel about my family's home. The annual harvest dinner is a tradition steeped in the scent of my mother's roasted chicken and the sweet, decaying perfume of autumn leaves. Yet, for me, it's always been a stage for a quiet kind of heartbreak. It's a room full of people I love, who I know love me, but who have never quite understood me. This year was no different. The table was laden with food, glowing under the warm light of the chandelier. Julian, home for the weekend, was holding court. He laughed, a loud, confident sound that filled the dining room, a piece of buttery roll caught at the corner of his mouth. "It's just a different stratosphere, Cora," he said, gesturing with his fork. "Not everyone is built for the pressure of a real corporate career. It's good to have a creative outlet, though. Keeps the mind sharp." A ripple of gentle laughter went around the table. My father nodded in that proud, affirming way he reserved for Julian. My mother offered me a soft, sympathetic smile, the kind that was meant to soothe, but always felt like a concession. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the way my voice seemed to shrink in the air before I even spoke. I focused on the delicate task of separating a sprig of thyme from my roasted potatoes, as if it were the most important job in the world. I didn't plan to say anything. For years, I had absorbed these little cuts, these casual dismissals. I'd learned to smile, to change the subject, to retreat into the quiet world inside my head where Lyra Systems was not a creative outlet, but a living, breathing entity that I was pouring my entire soul into. But then my grandfather, Arthur, cleared his throat. He did it slowly, a dry, papery sound that cut through the chatter. Grandpa Arthur is a man of few words, a retired shipwright who spent his life reading the tides and the grain of wood. He sees the world in terms of unseen currents and structural integrity. "Speaking of the corporate world," he began, his voice calm and even. He was looking at Julian, but his words felt directed at the entire room. "I read in the business journal that Apex Analytics has been shedding some of its less profitable divisions. A strategic realignment, they called it." Julian's smile tightened. "Yeah, a bit of restructuring. Trimming the fat. It's standard practice, keeps the company agile." He said the words with a practiced ease, as if reciting from a press release. "Is that what they're calling the acquisition of your entire Boston analytics wing?" Grandpa asked, his gaze unwavering. The room fell into a sudden, profound silence. It wasn't an angry silence, but a vacuum, where all the ambient noise of the evening, the clinking of forks, the low hum of the refrigerator, the rustle of clothing, was abruptly sucked away. Julian's fork, halfway to his mouth, froze in midair. My mother's hands stilled in her lap. My father blinked, his brow furrowed in confusion. I met my grandfather's eyes across the table. In their clear, pale blue depths, I saw a flicker of something, not malice, but a quiet insistence on the truth. He knew. He was the only one who subscribed to the local and regional business papers, reading them cover to cover like scripture. He'd seen the small print announcement of the deal we'd been keeping under wraps for weeks, pending final regulatory approvals. The deal where my small, intuitive design firm, Lyra Systems, had acquired the struggling user experience analytics division of Apex Analytics. The division where Julian was a senior manager. Julian's voice was thin, reedy. Wait, what acquisition? Slowly, I placed my fork and knife down on my plate, the ceramic making a soft click in the stillness. I turned to my brother. My heart wasn't pounding with victory, it felt strangely calm, steady, like a ship finding its anchor in a quiet harbor. The deal was finalized on Tuesday, I said, my voice even and clear. The official internal announcement is scheduled for Monday morning. Your division is being dissolved and its assets absorbed into Lyra Systems' primary development team. He stared at me, his face pale. The arrogance had evaporated, leaving behind a raw, boyish confusion. You knew about this? He stammered. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I led the acquisition. We've been in negotiations for 3 months. I paused, letting the weight of it settle. We have a different philosophy on how to interpret user data. Their board felt our approach had more long-term potential. No one spoke. Not a single person moved. My father looked from me to Julian and back again, his expression unreadable. My mother's hand had floated to her mouth. Then, Grandpa Arthur picked up his wine glass. He raised it, the crystal catching the light. To Lyra Systems, he said, his voice imbued with a quiet dignity. And to careers built on vision, not just pressure. And I just sat there, a small, sad smile on my lips. It didn't feel like revenge. Revenge is a hot, fiery thing. This felt cool and cleansing, like the first rain after a long, oppressive heat wave. It was simply the truth, arriving at the table uninvited, and taking its seat. Julian didn't say another word for the rest of the meal. He pushed the food around on his plate, his gaze fixed on the intricate pattern of the china as if trying to decipher a code he'd suddenly forgotten how to read. I didn't press the issue. I passed the gravy boat to my aunt. I listened to my father talk about the miserable state of his golf swing, and I complimented my mother on her apple crumble. On the surface, it was a normal family dinner. But underneath, the very foundations of our family dynamic had fractured. For the first time, my existence didn't require a defense. It was a fact, solid and undeniable, and the truth was now doing all the talking for me. Later, as I was helping my mother clear the plates, Julian cornered me in the kitchen. The warmth of the dining room didn't reach this far. The air was cool, smelling of soap and leftover wine. You let me sit there, he hissed, his voice a low, furious whisper. You let me talk like that, knowing you were about to pull the rug out from under me. I carefully rinsed a plate, the running water a calming sound. No, Julian, I said, not looking at him. You talked like that. You've been talking like that for years. The only thing that changed tonight is that I didn't try to make you feel better about it. He stepped closer, invading my space. The scent of his expensive, citrusy cologne felt sharp and out of place. This was personal. Don't pretend it wasn't. I turned off the water and faced him then, leaning back against the counter. What was personal was you calling my work a little hobby in front of every person we know. What was personal was you patting me on the head, literally and figuratively, every time I mentioned a milestone. The acquisition wasn't personal. It was a strategic move for my company. Your dismissal of me for my entire adult life? That was personal. You're just finally on the receiving end of a consequence. He scoffed, but it was a hollow, brittle sound. You've always been jealous of me. A genuine, soft laugh escaped me. It wasn't a laugh of mockery, but of pure, unadulterated surprise. Jealous? Of what, Julian? Your corner office? Your pressure cooker lifestyle? The fact that you have to belittle your own sister to feel successful. I shook my head slowly. I didn't want your life. I wanted your respect. When I realized I was never going to get it, I decided to build something that made your version of success irrelevant to my own. I didn't sabotage you. My work simply outgrew yours. His mouth opened, a retort forming, but just then Grandpa Arthur appeared in the doorway, a dish towel in his hand. He looked between the two of us, his eyes taking in the tension in the small room with an old, quiet wisdom. "Everything all right in here?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Julian took a half-step back, the aggression draining out of him. "Fine," he mumbled, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Just surprised." Grandpa's eyes shifted to me, then back to Julian. "You always did have a lot to say, son," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Maybe now is a good time to learn how to listen." Julian left a few minutes after that. There was no grand exit, no slamming doors. Just the quiet crunch of his shoes on the gravel driveway and the distant, angry roar of his Audi's engine fading into the coastal night. Later, the house had settled into its familiar quiet, the only sound the rhythmic sigh of the ocean in the distance. I was sitting on the front porch swing, wrapped in a blanket, watching the moon cast a silvery path across the water. Grandpa Arthur came out and sat in the old wicker armchair beside me. For a long time, we just sat in silence, a comfortable quiet that I had always cherished with him. "You know," he said finally, his voice a low rumble, "you didn't have to let it happen like that." I watched my breath plume in the cold air. "I didn't plan it," I replied honestly. But he set the stage and handed me the script. All I had to do was say my line. He nodded, a slow, thoughtful motion. "You have your grandmother's way about you." She never raised her voice. She believed that if you gave a fool enough rope, he'd either build a bridge or hang himself. She just stood back and watched to see which it would be. A real smile touched my lips. I guess that trait skipped a generation. He leaned his head back, his hands resting on his knees. "They'll call it revenge. Your mother will call it cruel. Your father will call it bad form." He paused, turning to look at me, his eyes kind in the moonlight. "But I know what it really was." "What's that, Grandpa?" "A course correction," he said softly. "Sometimes a ship is headed for the rocks, and the only way to save it is with a sharp, sudden turn. It feels violent at the moment, but it's the only thing that leads back to open water." We sat together for another hour, watching the tide roll in. The weight of years of being underestimated, of being the family's soft-edged dreamer, began to lift. It wasn't gone, but it was shifting, rebalancing, finding a new and truer center of gravity. Monday morning arrived with the pale, clear light of a New England autumn. In my office, a sun-drenched loft in a repurposed cannery overlooking the harbor, the atmosphere was charged with a quiet, focused energy. My head of operations, a brilliant woman named Nina, handled the integration process with seamless professionalism. I didn't have to lift a finger. But I saw the automated notification pop up in my inbox just before noon. Julian Sterling. Acknowledgement of separation processed. There was no surge of triumph. No desire to gloat. I simply archived the email and turned my attention to a new wireframe our design team was proposing. The work was the point. It had always been the point. But silence, I was learning, has its own sound. It travels. By 5 o'clock, my mother called. Her voice was laced with that carefully constructed concern she used when she was trying to mediate a conflict she didn't fully understand. "Cora, honey, I just spoke to Julian. He's devastated. He said you knew all along this was happening." "I was at the dinner, Mom." "You were there too," I said, my voice gentle but firm. I swiveled in my chair to look out at the harbor, where a lone sailboat was making its way out to sea. There was a hesitant pause. "It just seems so uncharitable, darling, to let him be humiliated like that." "Mom," I said, and the word came out with more force than I intended. I took a breath. What was uncharitable was listening to him mock my life's work every holiday for the last 5 years. What was uncharitable was you and Dad smiling and nodding along because his paycheck was bigger. He wasn't humiliated by me. He was humiliated by the truth. She sighed, a sound of weary frustration. "He's your brother. He's family. And I'm your daughter," I replied softly. When he dismissed me, did anyone ever remind him that I was family? The line went quiet. Then I heard the faint rustling of the phone being passed. "Your father wants to speak with you." Of course he did. My father, the pragmatist, the man who believed in clear hierarchies and established structures. His voice was diplomatic, the one he used to negotiate contracts. "Cora, I understand this was a business decision. I respect that. But to blindside your own brother at the dinner table, that's not how this family operates." I almost laughed. It was such a perfectly absurd statement. "Dad, with all due respect, this family has operated by quietly belittling my career for years. You're worried about me blindsiding him? He built a career out of trying to blindside my confidence. You could have given him a warning," he insisted. "A heads up?" "No," I said, and my voice was as calm and clear as the autumn air. "He could have respected me. He could have read the industry news. He could have listened, just once, when I tried to explain what Lyra Systems actually does. He had every warning he needed. The problem wasn't a lack of information, it was a lack of respect." My father had no answer for that. The conversation ended with a series of strained pleasantries, and I hung up the phone feeling not angry, but profoundly tired. And also, for the first time, free. That evening, I posted a simple message on my LinkedIn profile. It wasn't a victory lap. It was a statement of fact. A picture of my team, all of us smiling in our bright, airy office. The caption read, "Incredibly proud of the Lyra Systems team as we begin our next chapter. Today, we officially welcome new talent and assets through our latest acquisition. We believe in building technology that is intuitive, empathetic, and human-centered. Onward." I didn't mention Apex Analytics. I didn't mention names. I didn't have to. Julian must have seen it. The next morning, his own profile was updated. The prestigious title at Apex Analytics was gone, replaced by the stark, humble phrase, "Open to new opportunities." I looked at it for a long moment, feeling a pang of something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't satisfaction. It was just a deep, quiet sorrow for all the years we had lost to such a pointless, one-sided competition. By the end of the week, my inbox was flooded. Not with congratulations, but with quiet, discreet messages from people who had worked under Julian. "Thank you," one read. "The culture was suffocating. Excited to see what you build." Another said, "He never understood that data is about people. It feels like the right people are in charge now." I didn't reply to them. This wasn't about collecting praise. It was about rectifying a flaw in a system my brother had perpetuated. For years, he had been the gatekeeper of success in our family, the one who decided whose work mattered. Now his gate was gone, and I was the one holding the keys to the entire estate. And the strangest part of it all was that I didn't feel powerful. I just felt whole. Then, a week later, a text message from an unknown number lit up my phone. "It's Julian. Can we get coffee?" I stared at the words for what felt like a long time. My first instinct was to say no, to protect the peace I had so carefully constructed. But curiosity, and perhaps a flicker of that old, stubborn familial bond, won out. I agreed to meet him at a small, neutral cafe downtown, a place with worn wooden floors and the rich, comforting smell of roasted coffee beans. He was already there when I arrived, hunched over a table in the corner. He looked smaller, somehow. The bespoke suit was gone, replaced by a simple gray hoodie. The confident posture had been replaced by a slump, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. He looked like a man who had lost his map. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice low. He didn't meet my eyes. "What do you want, Julian?" I asked, keeping my tone gentle. He gave a dry, humorless laugh. "I think the answer to that is pretty obvious, isn't it?" He finally looked up, and for the first time, I saw not arrogance or anger, but a deep, cavernous exhaustion. "I underestimated you, Cora. I was a complete ass." "No," I said, shaking my head slowly. It was important that he understood the distinction. "You didn't underestimate me. You dismissed me. There's a difference. Underestimating someone means you think they're less capable than they are. Dismissing them means you don't think they're even in the game." He flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement. He stirred his coffee, which he hadn't touched. When HR told me Lyra Systems had bought the division, I thought it was a joke. A clerical error. Cora, I thought. My sister with a little art project? And then I saw the org chart, and your name was at the very top. He looked at me, his eyes full of a dawning, painful clarity. I was the clerical error. A wave of sadness washed over me. Not for him, precisely, but for the tragedy of it all. For the brother I might have had if he hadn't been so blinded by his own reflection. So, I said again, my voice soft. What do you want? He took a deep breath. I need a job. The question hung in the air between us, heavy and fragile. Are you asking me for a job, Julian? He nodded once, a gesture of complete surrender. I sat there for a long moment, watching him. I thought about the engineers he'd belittled in meetings, the creatives whose ideas he'd shot down because they couldn't be quantified on a spreadsheet. I thought about the culture I had built at Lyra Systems, a culture of collaboration, mutual respect, and psychological safety. A place where people were encouraged to be vulnerable, to fail, to dream. And I knew my answer. Julian, I began, and I chose my words with the care of a shipwright selecting a piece of wood. 2 years ago, you told me my company would fail because I was too focused on feelings and not enough on hard metrics. Remember that? He nodded again, his gaze fixed on the table. The things you see as weaknesses are the very foundation of what I've built, I continued. The culture at Lyra Systems is our most valuable asset. It's built on the kind of trust and humility that you and I, have never had. I can't give you a job, not because I want to punish you, but because you would break the thing I have worked so hard to protect. You don't know how to operate in a world where empathy is the bottom line. I stood up, leaving my own coffee untouched. I hope you find your way, I really do. But you can't walk this path with me. You have to find your own. And I walked out of the cafe, leaving him there in the quiet corner. There was no triumph in it. No final, biting retort. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about protecting my peace. It was about understanding that some doors, once closed, need to stay that way, not as a punishment, but as an act of profound and necessary self-preservation. After that day at the cafe, a new kind of quiet settled between us. Julian no longer existed in my world as a looming presence or a source of anxiety. He was just gone, a ghost in the family machine. The silence was no longer a weapon used against me. It was a space I had reclaimed for myself. The following Sunday dinner at my parents' house was a study in unspoken things. Julian's empty chair was a palpable void. My mother moved around the kitchen with a brittle energy, her movements tight and controlled. My father kept clearing his throat, a nervous tic I'd never noticed before. I chose to be a calm and steady presence. I brought a bottle of good Chardonnay, I helped set the table, and I asked my grandfather about the boat he was restoring in his workshop. I acted as if I weren't the architect of the silence that now filled the room. Halfway through dessert, my mother's composure finally fractured. She set her fork down with a sharp clatter. It was a cruel thing to do, Cora, she said, her voice trembling slightly. To turn him away like that. He came to you for help. I met her gaze, my expression calm. Mom, he didn't come to me for help. He came to me for a lifeline after he'd spent years trying to sink my boat. Helping him would have meant letting him drill a hole in my own. He's your brother, my father interjected, his voice rising. He's lost, and you just walked away. And I was your daughter when I was lost, I said, my voice remaining level, but with an edge of steel I hadn't possessed a year ago. I was your daughter when I was working 80-hour weeks out of my tiny apartment, pouring every dollar I had into this hobby. Where was this passionate defense of family then? Did either of you ever once tell him he was being cruel to me? My mother's eyes filled with tears, but she had no answer. My father stared down at his plate, his jaw tight. They were seeing the past not as they had chosen to remember it, but as I had actually lived it. Grandpa Arthur, who had been listening quietly, raised his glass of water. To Cora, he said, his voice cutting through the tension. Who learned that you can't save a drowning man who is determined to pull you under with him? Sometimes, the most compassionate thing you can do is save yourself. The table fell silent again, but this time, it was a silence of grudging acknowledgement. My mother wiped her eyes. My father nodded slowly, a gesture of defeat, or perhaps of dawning understanding. For the first time, I felt seen at that table. Not as the fragile, artistic daughter or the unlikely success story, but as a woman who had drawn a line in the sand to protect not just her company, but her own soul. Walking out into the crisp night air afterwards, I took a deep, clean breath. The salty wind felt like a benediction. Julian's fate was his own. My future was mine to build. And this time, there was no one left to tell me I was doing it wrong. A year passed. Lyra Systems flourished. We moved into a larger space, a beautiful old brick building on the waterfront that we renovated to be full of light and open, collaborative spaces. We were featured in a national design magazine, not as a curiosity, but as an industry leader. The article was titled, "The Empathy Engine: How Lyra Systems is Humanizing Big Data." I didn't send it to my family. I knew they would see it. Grandpa Arthur called the day it came out. "That's a good headline," he said, his voice warm with pride. "Your grandmother would have liked that. She always said the best tools were the ones that felt like an extension of your own hand." "Thanks, Grandpa," I said, a lump forming in my throat. "It took a long time to get here." "The best wood takes the longest to grow," he replied. "You were never weak, Cora. You were just patient. They mistook your patience for passivity. But patience isn't passive. It's a deep, quiet strength. It's the strength of the tide." The next major family gathering was Grandpa's 80th birthday. I flew home, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I walked into the old house not with armor, but with an open heart. I was no longer the person who had to brace for impact. Julian was there. I hadn't seen him in person since that day at the cafe. He was different. He'd lost the brittle, defensive edge. He looked calmer. He'd taken a job with a small nonprofit in Portland, helping them manage their donor databases. It was a step down in pay and prestige, but he spoke about it with a quiet enthusiasm I'd never heard from him before. Throughout the party, the dynamic was irrevocably changed. When my uncle asked about the stock market, all eyes turned to me. I spoke about market trends with the same easy confidence Julian once had, but I framed it in human terms, what it meant for workers, for innovation, for communities. Later in the evening, as I was looking at old family photos on the mantelpiece, Julian came and stood beside me. "That article about Lyra Systems was really something," he said quietly. He wasn't looking at me, but at a faded picture of the two of us as children, building a lopsided sandcastle on the beach. "What you're building, it's important work." I turned to look at him. The apology I once craved no longer seemed necessary. His transformation was the apology. "Thank you, Julian," I said. "The work you're doing sounds important, too." He finally met my eyes, and in them, I saw a flicker of the brother I'd always wished I had. "I'm learning," he said, with a small, self-deprecating smile. "It turns out feelings are a pretty significant metric." A genuine smile spread across my face. Who knew? We stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, the sounds of the party swirling around us. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. There were no hugs, no tears. It was something quieter and perhaps more real. It was the first plank in a new bridge, laid carefully across a chasm of hurt. As I flew back to my life the next day, I looked down at the coastline, the deep blue of the Atlantic meeting the rugged green of the shore. The story wasn't about my victory or his defeat. It was never a competition, not really. It was about my long, slow, painful journey back to myself. It was about learning to honor my own voice, even when it was just a whisper. The world had tried to define me, my family had tried to contain me, and my brother had tried to dismiss me. But like the tide, I had just kept coming, quietly, persistently, until the landscape was forever changed. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that I was finally in open water.